Good morning and thank you for joining us. We are continuing in week 46 through this incredible journey called the storied world of the Bible. And I am going to say the Jesus Creed, and then we're going to dive into our next session together. So will you join me as we say the Jesus Creed out loud together? Hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There are no commands greater than these. Right, here is the next part of this incredible course we are doing.
When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the hillside and sat down. His disciples came to him. He took a deep breath and began his teaching. Blessings on the poor in spirit. The kingdom of heaven is yours. Blessed on the mourners, you're going to be comforted. Blessings on the meek, you're going to inherit the earth. Blessings on people who hunger and thirst for God's justice. You're going to be satisfied. Blessings on the merciful, you'll receive mercy yourselves. Blessings on the pure in heart, you will see God. Blessings on the peacemakers, you'll be called God's children. Blessings on people who are persecuted because of God's way. The kingdom of heaven belongs to you. Blessings on you when people slander you and persecute you and say all kinds of wicked things about you falsely because of me. Celebrate and rejoice. There's a great reward for you in heaven. That's how they persecuted the prophets who went before you. When we find ourselves right at the beginning of the New Testament, we are reminded from the very first lines that this is a book which means what it means because it is hooking into the great story of the Old Testament. Matthew begins by saying the book of the generations of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Different translations have struggled with how to say that, book of the generations. The NRSV says an account of the genealogy, but the Greek makes it clear that Matthew is referring us back to Genesis itself, Biblos Genesios, the book of the Genesis of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. I have in my own translation rendered it the book of the family tree, but that again wouldn't necessarily send you back to Genesis, and it's Genesis where Matthew wants you to start. Because what Matthew then does is to tell a family tree going from Abraham to David to the exile and then to Jesus. Now, to us who don't know most of the names in this family tree, this seems like a very strange way to start a book. And in fact, many Christians thinking maybe I should read the New Testament are thoroughly put off by Matthew chapter 1. But actually, for a first century Jew, a genealogy like this would be hugely important, because the Jewish people had been through so many twists and turns, and particularly had been through the disaster of exile and the partial restoration which had happened, so that knowing who your family were, knowing that you were part of the ancient people of God, meant far more to them than any similar thing could be for us. Conceivably, in some countries like my own, there is a royal family that can trace their genealogy back all that length of time. But for most of us, genealogy is just a small hobby that takes us back a few generations. But for the Jewish people, the story of Abraham and his family meant what it meant because of the promises that had been made. In you and in your seed, your family, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1 tells us so many things right there about what sort of a book we are coming to, because Matthew lists the generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations, that's 2 sevens, of course. From David to the exile, another 14 generations. From the exile to the Messiah, another 14 generations. In other words, there are 6 sevens, and anyone who knows about how numbers work, particularly the numbers in the book of Genesis, would know that we are now waiting for the real new day to dawn, for the 7th seven, the time of release, the Jubilee moment. And this is the point, of course, at which the Messiah arrives. Matthew has built many other things into this genealogy. He, for instance, has shown how different nations have come into the genealogy by Tamar, by Rahab, by Ruth, and these different people coming in show already that within the family tree of the people of God, there are signs that God is not just interested in this one family, but is actually going to use this one family to draw other nations as well into this inheritance. And all of this points forward to the birth of Jesus the Messiah. And Matthew tells the story of the birth of Jesus and of all that follows from it in terms of echoes and resonances from the Hebrew Scriptures again, so that the birth itself fulfills a prophecy in Isaiah 7 about the virgin conceiving and bearing a son. It's important to say that there are no Jewish texts prior to Matthew which say that Isaiah 7 is to be interpreted this way. None of the messianic expectations of the time talk about a virginal conception. But Matthew, faced with what he knew about Jesus, looks back and discovers that there in Isaiah is a text pointing in this direction. But then in Matthew chapter 2, we have not only the prophecy from Micah about Bethlehem being the place where the Messiah is born, but we have wise men coming from the east, fulfilling those prophecies in the Psalms, in Isaiah, about people coming from far away, about kings and rulers coming to prostrate themselves before the Messiah. But then when Herod hears that there maybe is a new king born in Bethlehem, he sends his soldiers to kill all the little children there. But Mary and Joseph and Jesus have escaped and they've gone to Egypt. Yes, says Matthew, this is so that then when he comes back, there will be a fulfillment of what was spoken by the prophet Hosea. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Some people have said, oh, this is so fanciful. Matthew is just taking texts at random, which vaguely sound like something that's going on in the Jesus story. Not a bit of it. What he's telling us is that Jesus is embodying and recapitulating the story of Israel. Jesus is the one in whom the entire narrative of the people of God is now being summed up. So the little family goes then, when they come back, to live in Nazareth. And that is the fulfillment, according to Matthew, of a strange prophecy saying he will be called a Nazarene. And we're not quite sure what that is referring to, but it may be because of the shoot from the stump of Jesse at the beginning of Isaiah 11, where the word for that shoot is Natsor, is the word which is about a little shoot coming up out of the stump. Yes, Matthew is seeing it in terms of being called a Nazarene. And then in Matthew 3, we have the story of Jesus' baptism. And again, this refers back again and again to the baptism of Israel coming through the waters of the Red Sea, and to the promise of cleansing and refreshing and of a new Exodus, a new Passover, a new moment when God was finally going to forgive the sins of the people, when he was going to undo the exile once and for all. And Jesus is the one who is now carrying that promise. And so immediately afterwards, Jesus is sent out into the wilderness, just like Israel coming through the Red Sea and then spending 40 years in the desert. So Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness and is tested by the devil. And now we discover what is going on, that it isn't just that the dark power of Pharaoh or of Babylon has to be defeated, but behind every dark Pharaoh and Babylon, there stands a darker power again. They didn't have very good language for it then. We don't have very good language for it now. But the New Testament insists that if we are to understand the real problem in the world, we have to look for a power which is greater and more mysterious and more malevolent than any tyrant in human history has ever been. And so Matthew 4 is about Jesus doing again what Israel was supposed to do in the wilderness, only this time getting it right. And Jesus faces the three temptations which are listed in Matthew 4 and answers them with quotations from the book of Deuteronomy, which is precisely about Israel coming through the wilderness and being tested and being prepared to enter the promised land. So it should be no surprise that when we then stand back from the book of Matthew as a whole, we find that Matthew has ordered his material, particularly the teaching of Jesus, into 5 great sections: the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 8, then the teaching to the disciples in chapter 10, then the chapter of parables in chapter 13, and then more teaching to the disciples, especially about forgiveness in chapter 18. And then the last great block of teaching corresponding to the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 24, 23, 24, and 25, in which Jesus is warning about the way in which all this is going to play out, particularly focused on the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, because they have systematically resisted God's will. So here we have a new 5 books, Matthew is saying. Here we have a new Israel, Israel reformed, renewed, all around the person of Jesus. That is how Matthew's gospel works. As we jump to the end, when we see Jesus being crucified in Matthew's gospel, there are powerful resonances of the temptation scene. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. And now, if you are the Son of God, why don't you come down from the cross? Jesus, we are being told by Matthew, has encapsulated the story of Israel, and Jesus as the servant, Matthew is echoing Isaiah 53 at various points. Jesus as the servant is the one who is taking the shame and the pain and the exile of Israel. He is the son of Abraham, he's the son of David, he is the one who has gone to the place of exile. The genealogy means what it means all the way through the gospel. And now on the cross, he is dying under the weight of Israel's sins, of the world's sins, in order finally to defeat the dark power that had oppressed the people of God. And that is why in Matthew's resurrection narrative, in Matthew chapter 28, we find Jesus as the exalted Son of Man, Jesus as the one who is now the King of the whole world, exactly as the Psalms had promised. We find Jesus saying, all authority has been given to me. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. I've often said to people, we in the church are quite used to the idea that Jesus might have all authority in heaven. We've hardly begun to think what it might mean that Jesus has all authority on earth as in heaven. And indeed, that is something which the church has had to navigate and negotiate and wrestle with from that day to this, and we're still not very good at it. It plays out in terms of mission. All authority has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And when we think about what it means to make disciples, we go back through Matthew's Gospel to chapters 5 to 8, the Sermon on the Mount. That's the agenda for disciples, if you like. To the focused missional charge of chapter 10. That's what it means to be followers of Jesus, to be doing the works of the kingdom. To chapter 13, when Jesus talks about the sower and the other great parables of seed and growth, that the kingdom doesn't come by force, by violence. It doesn't come by being imposed on the world. It comes by seeds being sown, which grow up and bear fruit. And particularly, Matthew chapter 18, it comes through the power of forgiveness. The forgiveness which is the Exodus theme, the Passover theme, the forgiveness which is both deeply personal and also corporate. Israel had been exiled, we remember, because of sin. And now the message of forgiveness is that exile has been done away with. The new covenant has been launched, and now new creation is on the way. So making disciples means making Sermon on the Mount people, making seeds and sowing people, making forgiveness people, and now making people who are following Jesus, going into all the world, making disciples and baptizing them. Again, the theme of Matthew 3, coming forwards into the mission of the church, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. This extraordinary to us Trinitarian formula, summarizing all that has happened in Matthew's Gospel, drawing into one the vision of God which suddenly emerges as the result of the entire story from Genesis to this point. Teaching them, says Jesus, to observe everything that I have commanded you. But then the promise, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. This is the Emmanuel promise. Matthew began his gospel by quoting from that line in Isaiah 7 about the promise of the virgin who would conceive and bear a child whose name will be Emmanuel, God with us. And as we look back at the whole of Matthew's gospel, we see, not really surprisingly, that this is the promise about the new temple. God with us, the tabernacle in the wilderness, the pillar of cloud and fire, God with us. Solomon building the temple, the glory of the Lord coming to dwell there. God with us. And now, through all the twists and turns of exile, of partial restoration, of longings, of hopes unfulfilled, this then is what it looks like when God comes back in person to fulfill his promise, to renew the covenant, to renew creation. Jesus has encapsulated all of that in himself, Matthew is saying. This is where the story was really going all along. But the story isn't finished, because the story of Jesus, we discover as we read the Gospels, is from one point of view the conclusion of that story, but now clearly is the start of another story. And that's the story in which Jesus' followers themselves are summoned to take their part.